number one source, Sports Card Nation. The hobby is the people. Sports Card Nation.
What is up, everybody? Episode 360, Sports Card Nation, coming your way. Part 2 of our great conversation with Ryan Stuczynski from Gemrate. And we're going to tackle, this episode is going to be part 2 and longer than part 1. And we're going to tackle a lot of different things, including his takes on what he thinks going on in the grading market. Is it a junk slab era, as some people say? What did he think of collectors buying or acquiring SGC? Does he think the end is near for SGC? He's going to weigh in on that. And, as great as the work he does with Gemrate, he doesn't, those reports don't give kind of his feelings. So that's great. That's what's great about having him on, is we get really how he really feels or what he thinks is going on. So it was great catching up with him after a couple years. And again, we'll have him back on sooner the next time he comes on. But that's this week's episode. So let's get to it. All right, it is the conclusion of our conversation with Ryan Stuczynski from Gemrate, and we're going to start out here talking about what he thought when he heard the news that collectors had acquired SGC grading. I love your emails. I love the report itself, but the one thing you don't get with that, right, is your opinion. It's sort of, it's data, right? So I don't want to call it the hot seat, but I want to get your Ryan Stuczynski's opinion when that acquisition was announced, when collectors acquired SG. From a personal aspect, what were kind of your thoughts on when that news broke?
As somebody that lives and breathes this every day, I was caught off guard by it. And I feel like I'm reasonably in tune with what's happening. I talked to the teams enough where I feel like I'm clued into sort of certain initiatives, and I was caught off guard by that. And that sort of meant a couple of things. One is it sort of happened pretty quickly, at least in my mind. And again, it may not have ultimately, but just the lack of sort of whispers or visibility into that was really surprising, because I just figured it would have crossed my desk at some point. It obviously didn't. It felt like a defensive measure by PSA/collectors when it happened. And it felt like, you were hearing a lot of sort of chatter about what it might look like for fanatics to get into the grading space. And so I personally thought it was more of like hey, let's just do what we need to do to sort of quiet this. We'll make SGC work for us. There's certain synergies and overlap that makes sense for us to onboard no matter what. There's sort of a floor here that's pretty well understood. And let's sort of get to know and better understand the SGC brand as a part of this. And so it just felt like a logical way for collectors to sort of quiet sort of the competitive chatter from what it might look like for another massive player in the space to bring grading on board and scale at a pace that maybe could only compete with, only a few people could compete with PSA. So anyways, I think they just explored what that might look like. And at the same time, it was one where they figured they could onboard graders, in a way. The grading is a challenge. We talked about Beckett earlier. Like, Beckett is one of the reasons that they haven't grown as much as people wish they would have over the years, is they're just very particular in like their grading style. And like, it's just very hard. Like, we take for granted how easy it is to sort of fill these grading roles and what it means to train these graders and sort of, have people sort of advance or sort of filter out or flow out of the onboarding process. And, that was another way that I think PSA could rationalize sort of making that acquisition. So I think it was one that, to the short answer is that I think it was defensive. I could be completely wrong there. I have no visibility or insight into that. And I think it was one that's productive for them ultimately, in the sense that they learned a lot and they picked up a lot of, visibility into what was working over there. But, ultimately the direction they've gone in is that they're sort of minimizing that brand instead of investing in it in a way that might compete with, PSA a bit more, or sort of provide people with that second option at scale. And, ultimately, it just feels like they kind of have landed in the place where I do feel like it was a bit of a defensive measure, and they kind of kicked the tires on what that could mean for them, but ultimately landed in a place where, they're sort of prioritizing the PSA brand, which, again, not surprising, but sort of really suppressing the SGC brand in the process, which is frustrating for a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, I'll wear that hat as you know. They full disclosure, they sponsor this podcast, and they're good for the rest of this year. And I'm still am a bulk subber for them, right? I just had to adjust my rates as they've made the
Right.
discount rate go away. And people come up to my table at the show and they ask me, John, and they know, well, some of them know, like, my relationship, how far it goes, when they're like, John, I'm hearing this is going to be the end of them. And, collectors or, they usually say PSA is going to phase them out and
Right.
that sort of thing. And I hope that isn't the case. I don't have a vote or a say. But I mean, we're talking a year from now, or is seeing, we'll again, we can speculate all we want, right? Until it happens. But a year from now, is SGC still exist as a grading company?
I think so. I think what Ryan Hogue said over the summer is sort of the course that they're going down, which is, I think he was very candid and didn't really shy away from the idea that, look, boutique means something to us. And he gave a specific period of time, which was like 2016, 2017 levels for SGC, as far as he sort of envisioned where things might return to. And if you can look back at the data and some of the, comments that were made back then, they were only doing, 20 to 30,000 cards at that time. So I think they're going to exist. I think they're going to sort of service a niche around vintage really well. I shouldn't even sort of overstate that. I just think they're going to service that. Hopefully they do it really well, and that sort of continues to sort of carry them through and have significance for or play a significant role for the hobby, even for those people that's like their sweet spot and they love that brand and they want the consistency and the uniformity of having that continuing forward. So I think they're still around, but I just think they're not going to do, the things that sort of helped them excel the last couple of years was doing top specials and things like that, where they were grading 50,000 cards from the same set, right? Which is, one, great for them because they can, the catalog of cards we're seeing is pretty limited and the volume's really, fantastic for them for a short period of time. They're just not going to do that stuff anymore. So I think they'll still be around. And I also think it sort of has this long tail impact of when you think about how people price cards and slabs that they're in, to the degree you don't think a company is going to be around impacts the slabs. And so if you think that a company becomes less and less relevant, the slabs do take a hit one way or another. I think people just sort of devalue companies that sort of disappear. And so to the degree that they can sort of, even if they're only grading 20,000 cards, but they're grading them really well, it still helps the equity sort of sustain that these were really solid grading foundations that continue to exist. The proof is still sort of being delivered on every day. And so if I was sort of sitting in their seats at the collector's, table, I would think that that's the play, which is just, let's give them a little bit of room to operate. If something jumps, sort of, there's some certain places where they start to sort of surprise, or there's outliers for what they're seeing versus what we're seeing sort of at the scale unit of collectors and PSA, then they could take note of it. But ultimately, I think they're just going to let sort of their loyalists continue to lean into their sort of leverage SGC, but like really limit the resources that they devote to it.
Yeah, well, listen, great points. Great points. One thing I want to a point you made that I think people forget about, right? Like, having the brand still exist, right, affects the cards that already are in those slabs, right? If that brand goes away, and we've seen that with other brands that don't exist anymore, like out of sight, out of mind, and then obviously that's going to affect the value of any card encapsulated. So, like, to me, again, and I, like you, I don't have any sort of insider trading knowledge or anything like that, but I just don't. It wouldn't make a lot of sense to just get rid of SGC from collector's standpoint. I mean, I guess you can make both points for both sides, but something they would own would lose value even if they didn't want it to exist anymore. And listen, right, depending on the month, and I know it's been a bad trend lately for SGC, especially looking at the Gemrate numbers, but at one point they were 1 and 2, right? And that really wasn't necessarily debatable. If they make an announcement, hey, SGC is going away, this is the last day to sub any cards, and then that's it. I mean, there's always going to, we can say, but PSA is going to be hard to knock off that number one perch. but someone's always going to be number two, whoever that might be. They phase out SGC, and I think CGC walks right into the number two spot unchecked. Unchecked today. Again, 6 months from now, a year from now, 2 years from now, like you said, things can change, but they would really open up the door. Like the competition's not going away when it's like college football ranking. The team gets knocked out, someone else is moving up into that slot. So you're sort of opening, to me, it would be really opening the door. Even some would argue, Ryan, that the PSA sort of opened that door already somewhat for other companies. But you get rid of SGC, I think they're just opening the door wide open rather than a crack or a smidge. So, kind of your thoughts piggybacking off of what I make.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's I don't know if ironic's the proper word here, but just like intriguing is that SGC gave the playbook away. And, it's not an easy sort of switch to flip, but, if you want to counter the PSA, we're going to help make everything liquid after we grade it, a part of the equation, which is a long part of the equation right now, because the key component there is the grading equation is extending. And so the windows are growing. Like if you really want to shrink and improve liquidity for people, you get cards back to them as soon as you can. Like that's the ultimate way to improve liquidity, is get people their money or their cards back as quickly as possible. And if you're sitting in the CGC or the Beckett seats in offices today, you try to think about, how do we really think about ways to improve our turnaround times? And one of the ways that SGC was able to do it very thoughtfully was to do these promotions, which sort of really limited. You're not seeing every football card come in the door by doing a football promotion. You're not doing a vintage special. You're not doing a 1990 special. You're doing these specials which are really narrow and allow your team to grade a lot of the same cards and not have to spend as much time in the research and ID phase. And it's just, you're grouping a lot of stuff together that makes sense. And so, I would love to see somebody lean into that playbook a bit more and really, on the back end of that, then provide service that is sort of differentiated in our space. I think it's pretty well understood that it's hard to have a conversation or a real dialogue with a lot of companies in the space. They've obviously tried to improve that over the years, but it's just not an open line of communication, and one that companies really have put a lot of resources behind, including at the manufacturer level. And so to stand out there makes a difference, and sort of it's something that people will really appreciate and help you sort of build a lot of brand loyalty. So I would love to see people lean into that playbook, which has already been established. It's just a bit of a departure for some of these companies which haven't really operated. Again, I mentioned a big hurdle there is graders. You have to sort of scale graders, and that's the part of the equation that's the hardest part of it. So it's, how can you do it sort of in a way that allows you with the existing resources to make that happen, or to even do something that's a little bit more focused, like, hey, you're going to be a grader, but you're only going to be a grader for a specific 5 sets for a little while as we sort of do promotions. But point being is, it's I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and I do think PSA is just a big company at this stage. They're doing a lot of great things, but there's a lot of opportunity to chip away at what they've done and build on it, because there's a lot of people that are unhappy with what they're providing to the hobby today. And they're doing a lot of great stuff, but you're just never going to have all the answers. There's so many different people on with different perspectives and different journeys throughout this hobby. You can't service all the needs. And so there's an opportunity for somebody to, at least a company, if not a couple, to thrive as well, I think. And you saw that SGC had a fantastic outcome from where they were, right? Just by being the number 2 player. You don't have to be number 1 to yield a good return for your owners or your investors or whoever it is. And so there's certainly opportunities for a lot of companies in the space.
And as big as PSA is, and you know this, Ryan, I'm preaching to the choir here, and they are number 1. That's not really debatable. There are people, you've heard them or read, there are people who just don't like them, and like, I'm not giving my card. I know they're the number 1, but for my reasons, whether they're personal or I'm just not giving them, I'm not adding to their number oneness. I'm going in a different direction. And granted, you can say that every company, right? Someone's going to say, I'm not sending SGC, or I'd never send the Beckett again or anymore or ever, But for even for being number 1, that doesn't mean everyone loves them. They have their detractors as well. And you kind of pointed out on that. You mentioned them earlier, and the rumor I heard, I don't know, I'm assuming you heard it before the whole collectors acquired SGC actually went down. I heard, the whispers that Fanatics was trying to acquire SGC, and as a a lover of SGC, that was something I was definitely, someone else had heard it, and they know my feelings about SGC, and they called me up and said, John, what would you think about that? And I said, I'll be very candid. It's not a secret. Like, if that was to happen, that would be the end of my relationship with the brand. SGC had Fanatics acquired them. And here's where I come, and you're a collector as well, Ryan. So I'll get your stand. But here's why I felt so strongly about that, and still do. Like, if something, and this goes for any company, SGC was just sort of mentioned, or that was the rumor. But if Fanatics ever bought a grading card company, an existing one, or even started their own, I would have no relationship with that, because I just view that as a huge conflict of interest, that you would grade not only are you grading your own produced cards, in a sense, you're also then potentially grading your competition's products as well. It would, it just doesn't sit well with me, or sit right with me. So, like, had that deal went down when it was kind of whispered and rumored, which I'm glad it didn't, because that would have been the end of my relationship with SGC as a bulk subber, as a sponsor. It would, that would have been it. And it would have been sad, because I like SGC. So when that news broke that it was Collectors that had acquired them, it was sort of bittersweet too, right? I was glad it wasn't Fanatics, but then it was like, oh man, that's tough too,
Mm-hmm.
Kind of your thoughts on Fanatics, if they were to get into the grading space, whether that's acquired an existing company and absorbing them that way, or just building a new building and said, hey, we're Fanatics grading.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. I think you're seeing it all over the hobby right now, which is, it's just, for better or worse, the hobby's in a really great place, and that's for the better for the most part here. But you're still seeing a lot of people who are trying to recover from raising too much money, or sort of being overvalued a few years ago, and so ultimately they're in like prove it mode in my mind, and so people are willing to toe lines that under sort of a best case scenario they would avoid. And so what I mean by that is, you have companies like Arena Club who grade their own cards and then put them into slab packs. You have PSA who grades cards and then buys cards back through offers. Like, again, these are fine, sort of, if you understand the ins and outs of how they're sort of preventing there to be true conflicts, or what they might do to sort of eliminate or minimize conflicts. And I think that Fanatics was willing to sort of step and toe that line as well, if that was sort of really realistically like what happened there is sort of a scenario that was almost likely to play out. And so I think the challenge from a hobby standpoint is we all love to participate, and we sort of find we put our own boundaries in place. And I do think, like, ultimately, like, a Fanatics would have been fine had they done something like that, right? I think it would have frustrated somebody like yourself, and that does sort of put them at long-term risk, right? But the near-term sort of juice was worth the squeeze in sort of what they could benefit from a revenue standpoint, or from a product standpoint, or from an integration standpoint. And so, I do think and I think we're seeing that all over the place. I just think, like, I just mentioned a couple companies in the space who are doing really well and are willing to toe that line. And it's because they're still just trying to sort of, again, prove out this story for one reason or another. And they're ultimately like bigger picture stories that we're, as collectors or flippers or whoever you are in the seats that we're in, we don't hear the board meetings about why they're doing what they're doing. But usually it's much bigger than what we realize. And there's ultimately stories being told that are not relevant to our day-to-days, but matter to these companies. And so I do think, like, it was realistic that was something that was under consideration. I do think it would have, rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. I do think it would have been fine for Fanatics at the end of the day too. And it still could be fine for them ultimately, because, there are limited ways to participate in this hobby. And these are some of the biggest players we're talking about. And so, if you want to you can, hold the line and not buy from certain companies or not work with certain companies. But usually, just the way this hobby works is that the momentum will continue forward with those companies. It's not, enough inertia to prevent problems, and so, or to cause problems. And so, you're kind of wearing it as a part of your identity, and that's fine. That's a lot of what collecting is and sort of what we do. But it doesn't force a lot of change in our hobby, unfortunately, because people sort of move to where the dollars go and flow. And so, I think it would have been interesting. I do think it would have got a lot of pushback, but ultimately, like, I think it would have been fine, which is unfortunately what happens a lot of times. And I just mean, unfortunately, from the standpoint of, like, I wish there was bigger picture sort of pieces being put in place or safeguards put in place that would, not sort of represent this constant sort of, prove it mentality that's in the hobby, or sort of this money grab that's in the hobby today. So it's a challenge, but it's one that at least I think people are aware of. And, it's again where you sort of put your own personal boundaries in place, and you can talk about it, and you can sort of, speak to that stance and sort of try to help people understand why that's the case. But it's unfortunately just has like a little impact on like the day to day of what these companies do.
Yeah, as well as I do, right? Hobbyists have short memories, right? Something negative breaks and everyone talks about it, seems for like a week to 10 days, and then it just fizzles sort of right out. And then some people, not everyone, paint with a broad brush, but some people will forget about it. And like you said, they go where the money sort of goes. And, for me, I can only speak for myself. That would have been a sad day and a deal breaker. Like the whole
Right.
like my memory wouldn't be short there. Unfortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, that would have been something I would have. I don't believe like you should be grading your own products on a larger scale. Like I know you mentioned something like the PSA or some buybacks and different things along those lines. Repacks are what they are, and arena grading is not on the same level. They might not like hear me say that, but that's the way it is to some of these other companies we've already talked about. So, I just don't want to see a major player, let me put it that way, like grading their own products and also grading their competitors. Now they can say, hey, we're doing it in a sense, fairly and with equality, and we don't care. If it's a Panini card and it's a 10, then it's a Panini card that's a 10. They can say all the right things. It wouldn't sit well with me, and I guess what I'm saying is I probably wouldn't be buying it maybe as much as other people might be less, a little more forgiving of it. That would just, my moral state, whatever my moral standard level is, that one would cross it, the end for me.
Time for a quick break, but we'll be right back.
Iron Sports Cards is your #1 source for all your PSA and other grading submissions. Their elite status improves turnaround times. Heck, they even provide the card savers. Their chat rooms provide updates on all your submissions. They also offer wax options and single cards to cover all the bases. Check them out on Facebook at Iron Sports Cards Group or on the web at ironsportscards.com, or even give them a call at 1-877-IRON-PSA. Rob's got you covered.
Thanks for sticking with us. Let's return to the show.
I heard you mention it earlier, Ryan, and you hear this 3-word term thrown around, right? The junk slab era. We had the junk wax era. Now we have the junk slab era. And I can tell you, as being a bulk subber, right, some of the stuff that comes through, it's not my card, and people can grade whatever they want, but sometimes there's some head scratching cards, if you will. We're seeing your reports illustrate there's no shortage of cards getting graded. So your kind of take on the junk slab era, connotation, is it are we seeing it? Are we in it? Is it something that's even going to be a bigger issue, if you will? Like where do you stand when you hear those?
So I definitely think that we're in it's nuanced, but I was calling it a junk parallel era, because I think it's another level of that, which is parallels have made people comfortable grading cards that are not base cards, but many of these parallels are just glorified base cards ultimately. Like the hobby will not value them in the long run. There's sort of things that we're seeing stand out now, which are being, valued sort of accordingly, and maybe effectively too much at this stage, and what we're seeing, witnessing over the last few months. But I do think that it's made people comfortable that just because it's not a base card, it's going to sort of hold value over the long run. And ultimately, what we have is a ton of parallels that look the same or are, hardly differentiated, and are hard to understand as it relates to like the significance or role why they might actually, sustain or have meaning to somebody in the long run. One of the things that the manufacturers have been horrible at, and they were good at it 10 years ago, but sort of lost sight of, and now Topps is trying to do it, but they're sort of doing it in a way that's catering towards the high end collector a lot of times, but they've just been really poor storytellers of what they're building and why they're building it. And so if you want to put 100 parallels in the market, by all means do it, but let us know how you got there. Let us know what you were thinking, why you were thinking that, why it should matter to us. Like otherwise you're literally just saying, hey, we're pulling another one over you. See you in 10 years when you realize that this was us getting you again. And so, I kind of see that as the reality that we're in right now. And again, all it's doing is sort of flowing through to the grading companies in a way that people are like, okay, well, this has a number on it, so I probably should send it in, or it looks different than the base card, I should probably send it in. So the difference between what we were seeing 4 years ago is that people were grading a ton of base cards. Fortunately, people are not grading base cards, in air quotes here, because they are not base cards. But the way the hobby was going to treat these is sort of glorified base cards, 10 years down the line, because they don't really mean or stand for much. And so I do think we're in a junk parallel era, which is leading to junk wax, which is leading to, just people overvaluing a lot of cards that are being manufactured today, which is, again, no different. It just looks different, but it's not going to feel any different 10 years from now.
Yeah, I agree pretty much verbatim for what you well said. And I'm a base card guy. I love a nice rookie card, whether it be out of, Topps Update or Topps Flagship. I grew up with those, and so they always have a soft spot in my heart for those. And, we can go, we're not going to go down that road, Ryan. I'm not going to take you there, but, the whole real scarcity versus artificial scarcity debate and that sort of thing. It's why I lean vintage. I do collect. I don't want to make it sound I'm 100% vintage, but I lean more that way because, those cards aren't being made anymore, and they're not numbered. And we know there's not a prevalence necessarily, especially when you compare it to the way cards are produced today. Someone I get asked a lot about, and I know she's obviously on your list a lot, right? Caitlin Clark, WNBA superstar. I've heard her, and I don't think it's a far off comparison as you might initially think. I've heard her be compared to like the Michael Jordan of women's basketball, and kind of changing the hobby and the game on that level. And I agree. I know she's battling some injuries here, especially this season. She's obviously uber talented. No one can argue with that. No shortage of her cards being graded, and that's my argument to that is just the amount of cards that are produced of her, including a set that was just an all Caitlin Clark set, and there's just no shortage of So someone I always get asked, especially at my SGC table, hey Newman, you think I should grade this and this, and what do you think about these? And Caitlin Clark obviously is in a lot of those stacks, and it's always when it comes to Caitlin Clark, I always tell the person, like, that's beauty's in the eye of the beholder. If that's a card you want encapsulate, that's up to you. And again, with the numbers you're seeing and just her place in the hobby, like, what's your sort of view of Caitlin Clark as far as just everything kind of rolled into one, like the amount produced of her cards, the different sets, like you said, subsets and parallel. Is I see stuff and I'm like, I don't even know what that is. I have to look it up, and I'm set up at 2 shows a month. Just sort of you kind of your take on her place in the hobby and even in the grading space.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that you come to realize, and I don't know that I hear it articulated this way too often, but it's a power law hobby in the sense that the outliers, the extreme outliers, are the ones that sort of recognize almost all the gains ultimately in the long run in this hobby. Like, there's in between areas, obviously, like that's a little bit of an extreme positioning there, but ultimately people view her as that. This is not the right analog, but it's kind of like a ChatGPT comes in and you're an investor and you say, like, hey, here's somebody who might change how the paradigm or the landscape of how we think about things. And that's sort of Caitlin Clark to the average collector, or people who are looking to put money into somebody where they might have those power law returns, which is, this is somebody who transcends sports, who's going to mean something across many generations, and that will ultimately play out in the sense that her cards will hopefully hold value and beyond that gain value, right? Accrue value. So I think it's fine. I think it's fair. I actually think that's like appropriate. But what happens, and I come from many years of startup world, is you place those bets knowing that, but there's a huge risk associated with that as well, which is you just might have picked the wrong player, or you might have picked the wrong game to play or the market to be in. And so, there's massive risk there. You even slowly start to see a little bit more favor flow to like Paige Beckers right now because Caitlin's not playing and her stats were sort of don't represent sort of what she stands for. But ultimately, that might not matter. I mean, I'm close with Adam Gray, and he always speaks about like the cultural relevance outweighing sort of the performance that players have. And it's pretty hard to sort of make an argument against for what Caitlin Clark has already done for college basketball and for the WNBA. And even if she does not have a career that, she doesn't have the A'ja Wilson career of, many MVPs and just doesn't have sort of the titles to, reflect sort of who she is as a player. The character and sort of what she stands for might sort of mean far more to the hobby and to that league and ultimately what people care about and how they sort of, vote with their dollars ultimately. So I think it's fair. I think it's interesting. It's challenging to know. That's one of the reasons we're doing that eBay report now, because I want people to understand like how much money is going into Caitlin Clark, like relative to what we know. Like one of the ultimate metric that I'd love to bring to market one day is like, what does it mean for this much money to be spent on a player for somebody's cards to be priced as high? Does it mean that she has to win 4 championships and 4 MVPs? Like, is that actually what's being valued in this? Like, what does Mahomes' market mean today? Is that sort of price? That's subjective. It's never going to be a science, but it's just something that I like to be a part of the discussion, which is just like, what do their values? What needs to happen for them to actually achieve that value or sort of support that value that's being, at a card level or at a market level? And so I think Caitlin Clark's a fascinating story. I do think it's warranted for people to be doing what they're doing there, but there's a ton of risk. There's no certainty there.
Yeah, and she's represent like I'm glad you said that. She's represented herself well. Some other competitors have sort of taken their shots at her, some cheap, maybe some not as cheap. And I think she's handled it pretty well, and sort of a role to, at least in my opinion, sort of a role model, even in just that respect alone. Obviously, when she's on the court, she's a terrific player and a teammate from all reports and everything you read and hear. So I think as long as she plays, but she's already made, so, she could probably never play another basketball game again, Ryan, and we'll still talk about her in some respect and regard. Like you said, the cultural significance, that already sort of been established, and all the stats are like just on top of that, the cherry on top of that. And you can't say that about every player. And actually, you can say that about very few players, but I think she definitely falls into that category,
Oh, yeah.
And maybe that's where the Michael Jordan comparisons, like we still talk about Jordan to this day, and he hasn't played in many, many moons, right? And he's still significant, whether it's through Nike and the brand and the sneakers, the Last Dance airing a few years back, and even kids today. Like I'm in the teaching profession. There's kids today who are in my class that were born after he retired. He wasn't even playing. They were born. He was done playing. Who know who Michael Jordan is? Very few people who probably don't know who Michael Jordan is. So,
right.
And there's certain athletes that just check those boxes, and she's starting to check a lot of those and most of them, and pretty quickly. So, I hear the comparisons, and when you first hear that, like you think it's crazy, but then when you look at some of these intangibles and variables, like it's not as crazy as you think, especially if you don't count titles yet as part of those comparisons. They sort of make sense, and it's going to be interesting to see. She's really in the early innings, if you will, of her career, or the first quarter, for what basketball terms, right, of her career. And if she can stay healthy, and maybe there's a couple WNBA titles in the cards for her, I mean those are significant impacts and factors to come.
Yeah.
So the book is very. It's the early chapters are being written. There's a lot more potentially to go, and so it'll be interesting and we'll see where that sort of winds up.
I think it's one of the most exciting parts of our hobby when we're sort of our eyes are opened up to another something that we sort of dismissed as being insignificant becomes increasingly significant, which is Caitlin Clark or it's Paul Skeens. Pitchers were something that were ignored for years, and then all of a sudden now people are reconsidering. Caitlin Clark has made women's sports much more on the radar again, which is awesome to see. Anyways, I like when sort of we're challenged. That's why, and I personally love to do it from my own collecting standpoint. Like what is sort of something that's sort of understood today that could change 5 years from now, and that's where I sort of like to put my money at times. And so I love that because I just think that's the beauty of it. It's a very narrative-driven hobby, and it could change really quickly.
Yeah, and again, it's again great point by you, right? That and we love the debate, right? We love to compare players from the same era, from one era to another, from across, Jordan to Caitlin, who are obviously male and female, same sport, and I think it's human nature. We like to kind of pick a stance and then defend it or say why we're right and why someone's wrong. And as long as it's done tactfully, that's fun, right? As long as it doesn't cross lines, it becomes personal and people don't get that vicious or animosity about it. It's always fun to have those debates. And it's a great point, right? What she's done, not just her, but she's really sort of the face, right? What she's done for the women's side of the hobby. And collectors, and you go to the national, and I'm not saying just because of her, but just in general, you're seeing more women collectors. You're seeing more women dealers, which is great to see. We're seeing more women in the corporate spots of the hobby. So it's refreshing to see. I think it's important, and I think that trend needs to continue along those lines. And it's like when Jordan first hit the scene, right? He brought a lot of people into the basketball hobby that weren't collectors before. So there's, again, another comparison that could be made sort of between both of those athletes right there in a good sort of way. So, but listen, I appreciate you coming back. Again, way too long between appearances. I promise if it's up to me, it won't be such next time. But I always give the guests sort of the closing words, give out the websites where people can see what you and Gemrate are doing and get on board if they're not already. We are, but share, put any of that, take your time, whatever you want to get out there to direct anybody to.
Well, no, thank you. I appreciate you having me on again. I know you're busy, and whenever you need me, I'm here for you to jump on.
Well, you're making more of excuses for me than I am, and I appreciate that, Ryan. But it was my bad. Thank you.
No, we're good. One other quick shout out I wanted to give. I meant to mention it when I was talking about the eBay data. Thanks for bringing to market. But I exchanged emails with Dr. Beckett about this a few years ago, and I just want to hat tip to him because he and I have talked about sort of this concept of a hobby GDP, and this may not be the way he envisioned it, but this is sort of my first foray into that. And anyways, I just think it's a really interesting concept. One of the most important things about sort of what we do and what we stand for is that feedback is extremely welcome. I'm very grateful for, different perspectives and things that we could be thinking about, whether it's things you like or things you don't. But you can email me at ryan@gemrate.com. A lot of what we publish is on Instagram or Twitter. You can find us there. And then sign up for the email. Sometimes we publish things only specific to email, like that iconic tracker. So that's another good place to keep an eye on. Then I would just say the last thing is we have a couple new features / products we're going to be bringing to market over the next few months as well. So keep an eye out for that.
Well, let's do this. When those hit the scene, we'll have you back on, and we'll plug and promo those and talk about them and some other stuff too. And I'm sure in a few months there'll be plenty of new. We won't be short of topics, that's for sure, especially in this
no doubt
space in the hobby in general.
Yep.
Appreciate you, Ryan. Thank you for all the, I don't know if you hear this enough, but the hard work in getting that information to us and to the hobby. I think it's important, whether you use it for financial or just just want to see where trends are going and where the market is. And you can never have too much information. You can have too little, right? So thank you for all you do.
Thanks, John. Much appreciated.
All right, take care. Awesome having Ryan back on the show. And like I said, I promised him we won't wait that long again to have him on. But, since we've been going to double episodes, we have less people on. It's a little trickier getting folks on. But we'll have him back on sooner the next time he's on. He does a great job with Gemrate, and really important tool for the hobby now to really kind of monitor what's going on in the grading scale. And again, like I've always said, right, whether you like grading or not, whether you do grading or not, grading is a huge part of the hobby. And it is a factor into, pricing and what things go on. So, like it or not, it is what it is. So, with that being said, we're going to hear from our Hobby is the People announcer of the week and wrap up this week's episode.
Time for our Hobby is the People announcer of the week.
This is David Keppel. Remember, the hobby is the people.
If you'd like to be the Hobby is the People announcer of the week, do a WAV or MP3 file and send it to sportscardnationpc@gmail.com.